This is an incredibly formidable set of people, amazing talent if you're familiar with their work, and really, really formidable intellect. So we are very, very lucky and privileged to be able to have everybody together today. I think if you look at the topic, dissent is a language. What is the vocabulary? What's the grammar? What are the forms of dissent? What is the need for dissent? I think these are some of the things that I'll bring up. And I think to start off, if dissent is a language, then it's the mother tongue of women. Because if you want to be a full woman, if you want to be a complete citizen, then dissent is something as a woman, that's the starting act. Meera, that's your cue. How do you, yes. What do you see as dissent? And would you agree if I said a woman's mother tongue is dissent, if dissent is a language?
Maybe that is the first word she utters, Ma. Just like Valmiki started his epic poem, Ma Nishada. So it's like Ma is the no. She starts from there. I think that's the first word which liberates her. So I agree with what you said. Maybe if dissent is a language, art could be the nation. Okay. And there, what will be, what kind of government will we have? Should be liberation as a government. And then what kind of police should we have? Maybe that of, what should I say, empathy? And the kind of judiciary we have, again, liberty. Yeah. You can't have anything else, no? Art itself is a nation, and dissent is its only language. There is no official or official or the other language, national language. There can be only language, and that is what is called dissent. But I warn you, it is not so advisable to use it in other nations, other than that of art.
That of art. Neha, let me come to you next. As a journalist, what are some of the choices that you've had to make, and how does the fact that, how does dissent inform your choices?
Thank you for that question, because I think every possible thing that is done as a journalist, or whatever should be journalism when you talk about public interest, is dissent, because often journalism essentially is anti-establishment, right? Anything else that you are doing is not journalism. And so the moment you start questioning the establishment, you are dissenting in some way. I just want to say that what has, I don't know, maybe if you want to talk about it later, but what has really changed in many, many years is now that we have come to a point where very ordinary things that we are doing, even those things are seen as an act of dissent. And if I give a specific example, because I keep giving this example, in 2019, a journalist called Pawan Jaiswal in a place called Mirzapur in UP had done a report on how in the midday meal, students are being served salt and roti. And even for that story, which is like the most important but basic story, he got several cases of criminal conspiracy against him. So what I want to say is that dissent is now, for many of us, even the small things that every possible person sitting here is doing is an act of dissent. And that in itself needs a conversation, because where is this resistance coming from? Where is the fact that if I lift a bottle here and drink it a certain way, or if I wear a certain color sari that we were talking about, it becomes dissent or a political statement? That is something that needs to be discussed more.
So the areas of freedom and what you're pushing back against. Irenosen? what's your take on how do you see Dissent? How does it inform your wildly imaginative and very, very inventive writing?
Yeah, I definitely agree that Dissent is kind of a mother tongue for women. I think when you grow up, particularly for people like me in the West, you're at a disadvantage. You know, you're kind of living under patriarchal systems that put women and women of color and black women at a disadvantage. So you're almost finding ways to rebel from an early age. And I think art has really given me a platform to do that in ways that feel completely liberating and exciting and interesting, especially around expectations or who is allowed to do certain things, who is allowed to operate within certain forms. You know, even the way you're kind of, I guess, valued as an artist. I think Dissent comes into that too. So for me, it's kind of integral to how we move as writers and artists. And I certainly have found ways to push back, because I feel that, you know, Dissent is essentially about rebelling against the system and pushing back. So kind of circumventing particular expectations, not doing what people would, you know, foresee for somebody who comes in this package, you know, finding language to interrogate that, to contextualize it, but also I think to make it feel really liberated. You know, I really enjoy doing that. So for me, it's about creating these exciting frameworks and then also letting the audience respond to it.
Yeah,
you
and
know,
engage with it.
And engage with it, and then kind of make of it what they will. I love empowering women, but not necessarily in the way that people would expect. You know, we were talking about some of the short stories in the green room, and for me, that's really key, you know, to kind of have this intellectual conversation around, you know, dissent and language and what we expect, and how do we keep subverting that, you know, in a way that doesn't feel, I guess, protracted or not illuminating or not invigorating. You know, you want it to kind of, for me, it's also deeply feminist as well, Dissent. And I mean, look at the panel. So there's layers and layers.
I think a lot of effort and thought went into designing this panel, isn't it? Very, very carefully selected people. Githa, you know, your work, whether it was in the 90s, that petition in the courts for, you know, women and guardianship, to the work since 2014, the kind of documentation, the kind of activism that you've done. Give us a sense of what has changed since 2014, and this season of dissent, the way is a phrase that you've used to describe what we've been experiencing.
I can see you want to get me into trouble. Remember, we are coupled, and you are an accomplice. So we have plainclothesmen in the audience, you'll get into equal trouble. I actually want to begin with tying up what everybody's saying as probably the oldest on stage, and good Indians always pull age. So I want to say that dissent is something even more fundamental than specific constituencies such as women. All of us on stage, the womanelle probably got politicized through questions about why are we less than brothers and fathers and so on and so forth. But really, the language of dissent is the language of knowledge. Because whether you are a student, whether you are an IT techie, whether you are a poet, you cannot make that imaginative leap to knowledge unless you ask a question. So if you get received wisdom, and what is received wisdom? It could be that women need to be protected. It could be that the moon gets eaten up by a monster every now and then. It could be that COVID can be chased away by clapping plates. Right? So we know all this. We are experts now on the cleverness of our rishis. But let's move to our own cleverness, which is that we're not going to find out a damn thing about anything unless we ask a question. And dissent, this nice two-syllable word, has a punctuation mark as its mask, which is the question mark, right? And that's the basis of our democracy. Because the minute you've asked a question, who are you going to vote for? Who are you not going to vote for? Who are you not going to sit on the same stage as? You have made a choice, and that is a political choice. So I think dissent is something fundamental to human beings. And let me give you a very universal example that many women have experienced, and men. When you're told how to behave in certain spaces, perhaps in public, perhaps in a temple. I'm remembering Ananthamurthy a little mischievously here. What you do is test. You test by doing what you're forbidden to, and you see, aha, no lightning. Aha, so you say, this is man-made. This is one of the fundamental ways in which you learn, whereas you stick your fingers in fire, you learn a lesson for life. So I want to actually make dissent something inclusive. This is not the priority and the monopoly of urban naxals. Dissent belongs to all of us.
Well said.
Whatever they tell you.
Neha, so you made it very clear that as a journalist and the nature of the job, dissent is a part of that. Give us some experiences that you've had and choices that you've made where you've pushed back against what's expected from you, where you've asked the questions, like Githa put it so clearly. What are some of those instances or experiences that you may have had?
I do want to say that it's not just me, so many people around us, journalists like me, who have been dealing with it. Well, I'll give you some examples. Earlier, when one would report, for example, we used to laugh about, I was called, in my first job, my name was Hariharan Dixit because Haryana was very close to Delhi, and each time you didn't have story ideas, you would just go to Haryana and there were some stories to do. So there were Khap panchayats, there were honor killings, and mining or whatever. And for me, I can give you examples. It's not like I used to cover police encounters in UPA, and I've covered police encounters now. I have covered human trafficking by Islamic seminaries, by Maoists, and now by RSS. But it's the same stories that one is doing. And one has never looked at which political party is in power or who is running the government, but one has simply reported. And that's the same thing for most journalists who are, and not just journalists, everybody sitting here and everybody sitting there is facing that. That now what is different since 2014 is that, like when I joined journalism, my editor clearly told me, if you get a legal notice, that's a badge of honor. So we were all always looking for this badge of honors. But what has changed since 2014 is that they've started filing law and order related cases against people. And the moment you start filing criminal cases in the court, it obviously takes longer, it requires resources. For somebody, and we have to understand that, I'm particularly talking about journalism, where everything has been outsourced to freelancers now, right? So it's the freelance journalist who goes somewhere and gets you report from someplace, but essentially you do not have any kind of padding. And so for me, for example, I'd done this story in 2016 on how 3 Hindu right-wing organizations had trafficked children from the northeast of India, and it was almost the same kind of template that was used for residential schools in Canada and in Australia, where indigenous children were taken by Christian missionaries and kept for so many years and stripped of their culture and language and everything. And so I tracked these 31 girls between the age group of 3 to 11 who were from Bodo and Santhal tribes, and the parents were promised free education and lodging for these girls. But once the girls were taken away, the parents just couldn't contact these girls at all. So I managed to trace, 2 years later, I managed to trace 20 of them in Surendranagar in Gujarat and 11 in Patiala. And when I met these girls, these 3-4-year-old girls, they were not allowed to speak their own language. So they were only allowed to speak in Gujarati and Hindi, which means that these are 3-4-year-old girls, and 2 years they haven't spoken their language. So when they go back home, they can't actually have a conversation with their families. Or they were supposed to be vegetarian, and they did not have any formal education, but only bhajan and sanskar classes. And one of the girls, 7-year-old girl, she told me that when she grows up, she wants to be somebody called Rani of Chota Kashi, because Surendranagar was called Chota Kashi, who basically immolated herself to protect herself from Muslim and Christian invaders. So obviously, so this story was done. These were 31 girls. And once the story came out, a couple of criminal cases were filed against me, the publisher and the editor. This is the 8th year, and I have to travel from Delhi to Guwahati twice or thrice a year. The good thing is, now I'm talking about the Dissent, which is the good things that come out of it is that I'm very thankful that those cases are in Guwahati, because at least you get to see like beautiful part of Northeast India, so you do that. Or, and it's not in Rewari, Buradi, someplace like that. So that's the good part. But the fact is that because I worked as an independent journalist when I did this story, I do not have any institutional backing. And so that brings me to the other question, and this is the same with Pawan Jaiswal or many other journalists that we recently saw, Siddiq Kappan, and many other people, endless names. The fact is that then we are also making journalism as something that only the privileged can practice, right? Which means if I have the support system and if I can muster up resources to be able to travel to Guwahati and fight the case, then I will think of doing the stories that need to be done. But if this is going to be a perennial, everyday problem for any journalist doing anything, you just cannot do it. So that is something that also one needs to look at, so yeah.
Meera, we are in Bengaluru. This is the Bangalore Lit Fest. This is where Gauri Lankesh was assassinated so brutally. It shook you, and I mean, it shook all of us. But you took that experience and you made, you used it as material for your book, The Assassin. You wanted, I got that right? The Assassin. So give me a sense of how you take what's happening around you and use it in fiction, because that's a form of expression of dissent. And one that perhaps resonates much more.
One problem with panel discussion, especially with this formidable women, is that you just forget yourself and listen to them, and you have no idea how to start your what you have to say. And now that you have asked me the question, thank you. So actually, although I dedicated my book Assassin or Ghatakan in Malayalam to Gauri Lankesh, you cannot say that it is kind of a biopic or based on her life story or so. But there is another story called Death of Bhagavan, which was more explicitly based on what was happening in the time 2014 when Dr. Kalburgi was assassinated. So it was Death of Bhagavan, and it was published in Malayalam as Bhagavante Maranam. It shocked me for many things. One thing is that it was one of the series of killings that took place in those days. 2015. Yeah. There was Dhabolkar, Pansare, then Dr. Kalburgi. And Kalburgi was no lightweight person. He was a heavyweight in Kannada literature and a scholar who was adored and admired by all of India. And he was even the secretary in Kendra Sahitya Academy. And he was someone who had to be treasured by us. But then after his death, as you know, the state, the prime minister, the president didn't issue any condolence message or anything. And I was thinking about that. And looking at the hit list, they openly publish. By they, I mean the right-wing extreme Hindutva organizations who issued such a hit list very publicly, very courageously, very boldly. All of them were above 60. So what do we think of living in a place where the state is afraid of, scared of their elderly persons, their wise persons, people who have seen life, who have been witnesses to many things have happened in our country, people who have gone through that. That's one way of rewriting history, and that's the easiest way, I think. So silencing dissent, just like Githa Hariharan said, this is erasing knowledge as well. Knowledge of ourselves as a nation, ourselves as a total citizen, complete citizen. And this is very important to women because we were always denied access to real knowledge about what's going on in our life and in around us. And when I wrote about this, I had to do a lot of research to understand the political and spiritual nature of that killing, which was kind of multi-layered. And I wrote that story. Actually, it was as it was exhaustive as writing a novel. And I wrote that story, and it was published in Malayalam. And then people started calling me from different places and said they should come in English and Kannada. Dr. J. Devika translated it into English, and Caravan published it those days. But then it was not published in Kannada because I couldn't find a translator. But then when I met Dr. K.S. Bhagavan, who was again one of the names figured in the hit list, he was so excited that he translated it into Kannada with the help of a Malayali, Mr. Shekhar. And very ironically or ominously, it was published by Gauri Lankesh's publication, Gauri Lankesh Patrika. And then Dr. K.S. Bhagavan told me that after reading the story, Gauri Lankesh cried. She said someone should have written this in Kannada, and she's happy that someone actually wrote it. And that was the story of that story, and soon after it was published, it came out in the book form. I was in US as a visiting fellow in University of Pennsylvania, and one fine day, that September 5th of 2017, I woke up reading this news that Gauri Lankesh was shot dead. You can't imagine how shocking it was, because for me, it is not like a person was a political killing or something. You cannot reduce it to a political killing. This is much more than that, because we have heard about women being targeted in many ways, in family, on the streets, wherever you dissent, you will have to, you will have a punishment for, of course. Nobody will pardon you for dissenting, for questioning, for disobeying. But this was the extreme. The state has punished, has been looking at silently, has been silent towards the punishment of the killing of a very knowledgeable citizen, and irrespective of, you know how women are being projected in the religious texts practiced by them. Still, I didn't see much response from those who should have responded very, very strongly. And that is the story of, I wanted to tell her story again. I wanted to remind the people, make aware that we are living in such a such a time where fiction is far less stranger than the real happenings.
Githa, the price of dissent. Tell us about it, because you've been documenting it, you've experienced it firsthand. Take us through, because it doesn't come for free, you know. We know that. So what is the price of dissent? What should people be aware of when they decide to question and seek knowledge, and therefore dissent?
Yeah. Well, I don't think I can do a manual, but let me say there are losses which don't necessarily involve the obvious individual. So I'm going to talk about the group, because one of the few gains for you as an individual when you dissent is that you dissent with other people. And this is not romanticizing marching shoulder to shoulder. We women are very lucky because society allows us to express fear. And of course, the state, the police, the agencies are frightening. You would have to be singularly lacking in imagination and intelligence if you pretend you have no fear. So the first thing, which certainly women, thank God, find it easier to admit to fear, because you admit to fear and then see how you can struggle with it. When you're writing your novel, all the time there's somebody standing behind you, chauvinists of all varieties. But I want to talk about the loss that all of us experience. Think of students, for example. So the wonderful Tamil writer Bama, who writes on Dalit issues, she grew up in a small Dalit village. Her extraordinary book of stories, Sangati, which means messages, was dropped from the Delhi University syllabus because in all their wisdom, the Delhi University Academic Council felt that the students will be hurt if they read about caste, and especially if they read about what caste does to women. So their tender hearts didn't allow them to give the students a clear-eyed view of India's most ghastly, most horrific contribution to the world, which is the caste system. So, you know that when people want to protect you, young people in the audience, do check on what they want to protect you from. It's always suspicious. We women have been fighting for a long time. We're not goddesses. Please let us be citizens first. So, so the price of dissent, sadly, I cannot tell you the truth I've been experiencing for the last couple of years, because we have n number of court cases. I certainly want to write one more book, and I want to do it from the comfort of my study.
No, I mean, it's a very real fear that she may not, I mean, you know, yeah.
Yes, you must laugh because, listen, I must say something there about laughter. Let's look at the good news. Let's not whine so much together. There's so many of us here. One thing is that you've noticed in the last few years, anybody with a cell phone, anybody can put up a YouTube channel, anybody with a social media handle. There's lots of junk, of course. There's always junk. But, like lotuses in the pond, you have people creating satire, creating laughter. Once you've laughed at a monster or a group of monsters, they're not quite as scary as they were. So that is one thing we all share in. So laugh on, make fun. The other bit of good news is, you know, there's such a thing as failed action. We think of the Bhakti poets. They fought against caste, they fought against gender inequality, and their movements might have failed, they might have been absorbed into the caste system, but they were there, their legacy is there. Similarly, in 2014, many of us writers, particularly K. Sachidanandan, the Malayalam poet, many academics, including Romila Thapar, many legal luminaries, including Indira Jaising, and then lots of names which need not be familiar to you. But everybody came together from the academic and cultural communities to say, we can't keep quiet. Yeah. We can't just react. Yeah. Can we please set the terms of debate for once? So after Perumal Murugan was hounded, so that he said, I'm no longer a writer. Yeah. For a writer to commit suicide on Facebook, how shameful is that? And then, of course, Dabolkar, Pansare, Kalburgi, Gauri, and all the people we don't know about. Yeah. All the people who are not in the headlines. So at that point, we decided that it's just not enough to be writers, going on and on about our, what's in our heads and what our readers are telling us. Let us be citizens as well. And we set up something called the Indian Cultural Forum, a public charitable trust. It was amazing the number of people who contributed. There were professors from all over India saying, can we send you 1,000 rupees and so on. Now, 4 days after we set it up, people started, of course, the Kannadigas led the charge. 4 Kannadiga writers returned their awards first. And I think we should remember that because the so-called national media never remembers people from our parts of the country. Then Uday Prakash, the Hindi writer, returned it. But then, since we are so obsessed with his master's voice, they were very excited when Nayanthara Sehgal returned her award. So suddenly, the Indian Cultural Forum, all of us ignorant writers, desperately learning to be activists, desperately learning how to work with sites, not doing a damn thing. And if you work with writers, it's very difficult. A consensus on a common letter to the Sahitya Academy. I've been an editor for many years as a publisher and editing my own work, but I did 17 drafts because there was so much argument. How dare you write about Kashmir? Or my beloved friend Keki Dairwala said. Then somebody else said something else. So the point is, people as difficult, as individualistic as writers could get together. And not only did they get together, the scientists, I hope there aren't any scientists here who will take umbrage, but it's awfully hard to move scientists. Almost as hard as moving writers. So scientists agreed with us, and after a while, we became so mixed up that in the paper, I saw Pushpa Bhargav returning his, what is that other honor? Not Padma Shri, Padma Bhushan, saying we must also have the right to love. And even the semicolon was in the place where I would have put it. So I said to some people, my God, who's this man? He writes just like I do. So they looked at me and said, don't you remember you wrote a template for everybody? So we actually had something going there. And we put out statements that were signed. I'm very proud to say this because all of us are so quarrelsome. We had statements signed by everyone from the Gandhians to various shades of liberals, to various shades of left. So except for those who believe that trolling or lynching is a form of argument, we had everybody on board. So we have sadly had to close down the forum, and as a tribute to all those who came together and all the rich work there was, I've put together 20 of the conversations I had over the years with those who wrote from different languages, those we would never have met if we had not come out of our studies and looked at the real India we live in.
I want to do a follow-up question on citizens' involvement. We saw Shaheen Bagh as a shining example, but let me bring Irenosen back into the conversation. You're listening to the kind of resistance, that intellectuals, writers put forward in the past decade and more. and how, Githa puts it very, very lightly, but this whole transformation into becoming activists, not easy. Are there any things that you see that in other societies or in England that you find some commonality with?
Yeah, for me, it's really illuminating to hear about your experiences. This is my first time in India, and it's been incredible. It's a real education. But I want to come back to your point about expectations within the space, because I think, especially in the UK, especially as a person of color, there are expectations around that. Often the higher up you go, people want you to be grateful to be in the space, especially as a woman, especially as a black woman. You get into certain spaces of success and you're not supposed to shake the table. For me, Dissent is also about shaking the table. What's the point of getting to the table and not doing that? So, for example, I do a lot of judging work in the UK around prizes and literary recognitions and awards, etc. And being in those spaces, what I found is very often those lists are very, very white, and that's something that's intrinsic. So I won't name the award, but one particular award, I remember that we got to shortlisting stage, and I had to say to the head judge, does everybody realize that every writer on this list is white, and a lot of white men? We actually need to go back to the drawing board and look at some of those voices that have been ignored, those voices of color whose work are just as vital, just as important, have just as much merit, and actually assess them again properly and then include them in the list. So, and it was really interesting that that judge was very embarrassed about that happening. And I said, when this list comes out, I don't want to be embarrassed that I've been a part of this. And we haven't recognized these voices. I mean, voices doing incredible things, being really political, talking about people's rights, talking about, what it means to kind of live in the West. So that was a really interesting process. And we talk about the cost of doing that, the cost of putting your head above the parapet. Sometimes you don't get invited back, for doing that. Sometimes you're punished for being seen as a troublemaker. But what I found really helpful is, like you said, galvanizing certain groups of people and certain spaces to kind of not be the singular voice, not be alone. So finding those allies who are on the same page. And I think it's made for a much more radical space, a much more interesting space as far as I'm concerned. And yeah, I want to continue to kind of move forward in that vein. Like, how are we using our voices and our books to kind of help elevate the space in a different way?
Neha, to pick up from where Githa left off, Irenosen also talks about allies and alliances and finding like-minded people, galvanizing people, but it still stays within a certain class, a certain language group maybe. How do you make it reach more, citizens? Because that's the only way that you can actually create real pushback. And Shaheen Bagh and the example that we saw in Delhi was, I think, an example of, citizens getting activated. Is there anything that you want to add on that? How to get people into the mix?
I do want to say that, like you correctly said, in the last 10 years or so, it's like, and Githa also was saying, it's not like people have kept quiet. So, of course, the award Vapsi happened. Of course, there were a lot of prominent people that made the correct noises and led many other people. But at the same time, like you mentioned, Shaheen Bagh, or the farmers' protest, or so many such movements where people have come out and done things and they have said that we do not agree with this. But at the same time, apart from these statements, bigger statements, we also have to think about how people in their own ways, if there is an informal worker or a migrant worker, in a city where the entire system is against you, right? You are constantly subjected to violence by the police, you do not have the resources, but at the same time, you're constantly resisting and making sure that you survive. That in itself is also dissent, and that is not acknowledged because we have corporate media, because the media decides that we're going to write about urban rich or this is not for our readership or whatever. So that is something that also needs to be acknowledged, but at the same time, you said class and caste is a big, big problem there, how to galvanize support for people across classes and caste. I do want to say for example, for women, we have a network called Network for Women in Media in India, which is a collective which has 700 women journalists, which across classes and castes. And it's a collective, it's not an organization, so nobody is actually controlling things, but there is a lot of support. And once you see other people kind of reaching out, you also tend to reach out. So it's more organic, and a lot of people who have been out there have got that support system, not just for NWMI, but many other people who have faced any kind of backlash. There is an integral need to have that support system, and that is not just driven by people who are prominent, but also people from the most remote margins of the society too now. Because if somebody is getting lynched in Assam, in a forest, or being thrown out because they're Adivasi and the government wants to take over that land, there are people who are resisting, paying with their lives and with a bigger cost. And that dissent is also something that gives everybody else the power to actually come out and speak more openly about it.
Mentioned collectives, and we just saw in Kerala the efforts made by the WCC, the Women's Collective in Cinema, and what it has resulted in that industry. I think the clock is counting down. I need to open it up to questions. Yeah, sure, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, of course, though we are engaged citizens, we are, I'm not sure about Neha, but I don't think we are activists. What we can contribute to is making a difference in the site of culture, whether it's in university spaces or in art and so on. And what are some of the practical things that people do, and not necessarily prominent people? So the forum I was talking about, one of the things that we found were that artists in different parts of India, writers in different parts of India, are engaged in projects that actually include more people in the cultural arena. For example, in an online culture magazine we had called Guftagu, the first gallery was not one of the more famous artists. It was work that the artist called Vasudha Torur had done over 10 years with the girls who were victims of what happened in Naroda Patia in 2002. And she had this amazing art project with them called, in the aftermath of what they went through, what do they need the most? They need himmat, courage. And how do you get that? Through friendship. So this art project was called Himmat Through Friendship. And so these girls got together, and over the years, they were part of this art project. So that is one thing. Then, if people work hard to make voices which are usually muted in the mainstream heard. Here in Karnataka itself, we heard about a young poet who's the son of a Devdasi in Davanagere, who was attacked by right-wing goons for writing poems about caste, given where he comes from, and they said they would break his fingers, which is, says quite something. And then we brought his poetry to other universities. So I think these are the practical kind of things we can do in the cultural field.
Okay, wait, yes.
You were asking me a question. She was asking me about WCC and Sabarimala.
I didn't bring up
Okay. Then what else?
That's part.
Yeah, whatever. I think all of them were close enough to be the three phases of one problem. That is the nuns fighting against the bishop and WCC and Sabarimala. My only concern was that comparing with the number of women who express their dissent in such very important issues, the number of men who dissented were very less. I expected a group of men escorting women, or a group of women supporting, group of men supporting women, all the major issues, but I didn't see that even in our, in Kerala, which boasts of 90% literacy and 100% literacy and everything. So that is my appeal to you, that those who consider men amongst you should be courageous enough, more courageous enough to express your dissent. That's the only.